This program is made possible by the National Endowment for the Arts, with additional funding from the Maryland Humanities Council. Colm McCann talks with Colm Tóibín.
Welcome to The Writing Life. My name is Colm McCann and we're here today with Colm Tóibín, author of the novels The South, The Heather Blazing, The Story of the Night, and the non-fiction titles A Walk Along the Irish Border, Homage to Barcelona, and The Sign of the Cross, Travels in Catholic Europe. Colm has won numerous awards for both his fiction and non-fiction, including the Irish Times Aer Lingus Prize, the E.M. Forster Prize, and the Encore Award. He is, I suppose, in every sense, very much an international writer. He's published in 15 different languages, and the landscape of his work moves through territories as diverse as Argentina, Spain, France, and, of course, his native Ireland. He's also well known as a journalist, critic, social commentator at home in Dublin. And he is, in the words of Lorca, for me, he's a writer who's always there when the bread comes out of the oven. Or in the words of another American poet, Jim Harrison, he's there when the thorn enters the skin. He does this with great control and tautness. His language is wonderfully sparse, unadorned, and layered. I know people who've read his novels 5 or 6 times, and each reading has brought them something new. So it's wonderful to have a chance to sit down and talk with Colm. And I suppose it's a bit bizarre that we're both here in front of cameras in Maryland.
Yeah. I've been in Yaddo trying to finish a new novel.
What are those art colonies like?
Well, I've been in the one in Ireland quite a lot, and the one in Ireland can be quite, it's a place where writers and painters come to work. Now, if you don't work, you get depressed. That you have your first focus has to be work, but obviously, after a few days, your second focus becomes very clearly the other people. What are they like? What are they saying? What's the group like? And there'll always be 1 or 2 people that you have a lot in common with, and there'll always be 1 or 2 people that you really would rather bring home with you, if you had a choice. And then that goes on until you leave, and you with 2 or 3 days, you've forgotten it all, except, of course, the work you did.
But it's very concentrated, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very concentrated, and you really are better to stand up always and go back to your room and get on with your work. And if you're not doing that, there's something wrong.
Does it not drive you mad?
It's very, very good for a concentrated, when you really want to only think about the book, with no telephones ringing, with no, people blame other people for distraction. Right. But I think a writer you cause most of your own distraction. Yeah. By having to go out and do something or pretend you have to phone someone. Right. But in these places, you don't have a phone in your room. Right. So you can't phone someone. And you also have a general focus on work, that this is a place where this work is done. So it's useful.
And you're stripped bare. I believe you're working now in longhand.
Yeah, I've gone back to longhand. I realised there were a few chapters of my Barcelona book that I thought were particularly well written. Right. I thought I had particular control over the sentences, that I was actually enjoying almost the sort of physical presence of the words on the page, and they were written in longhand.
Really?
And I realised as well that one of the problems with using a word processor is how easy it is to correct. And therefore you tend to feel, I've corrected all that, when you actually all you've done is have read it over and changed bits. But if you've got a biro, a sort of smudgy biro, and what I do is I leave the left hand blank, work on the right hand page, and then after every page or 2, go over it all again and rewrite a whole lot of it on the opposite page. Right. And obviously then I put that onto a word processor. But I'm working fresh now, for the first time in a long time, in using the methods of childhood. Right. Using the very first ones learned, which are a biro, a cheap biro, right, and a cheap notebook.
That sounds wonderful.
Well, it's at the moment it's working, and there's some funny things, especially with proper names. I have a woman called Lily, and I have a guy called Paul, and I have a woman called Dora. And I love the big D of Dora, right, and the big P of Paul, and the L for Lily.
So it's all tactile.
And you actually, great, I'm going to write Lily, so right, you write down the L. And you actually, you flourish with the L.
Right.
And all my Pauls, the P is really quite seriously made.
That's great.
But obviously, you know, I mean, if you concentrate too much on the orthography, you know, I mean, basically you're just working.
So the words bump up
So
against
it
each other.
probably is exactly the same as working on a word processor. But just, I thought I'd give it a
It's
try.
a very romantic notion. Scribbling away late at night.
Yeah, and you don't,
with your-
obviously you can work anywhere. I mean, you could go up the top of a mountain and work with your electricity.
Right.
You don't need a machine.
Tell me, what would you do if you weren't a writer?
Well, I've always wanted to be a lizard. In other words, somebody who would flit, who would enjoy the sun. You know, you watch a lizard on a white wall, almost feel that you can't quite be sure at first it is a lizard because it could be a piece of ivy or something growing, and then it moves like that, darts, and it's gone. You don't see it again.
Are you a chameleon?
Well, I like the Mediterranean, and I like disappearing, and I'm not sure that I've any special identity myself.
Right.
I suppose people who know me very well, when I learned to drive, which I did quite recently, somebody said, your driving's very like yourself. And I said, well, what's that like? They said, well, it's consistent. I didn't know I was consistent. I would have thought I wasn't.
Right.
But one of the great things about writing novels is that you can lose yourself. You can reinvent yourself any number of times. And that it is better to be nobody,
Right.
which isn't necessarily true if you're a journalist or if you're a door-to-door salesman. It is better to be somebody in those, or a politician. But in this case, it's the less that's in you, the less that's in you that can be tied down or as anything. And of course, the fact that I live alone makes this much easier because I don't have to bother with anyone much.
Well,
You
is
know,
the-
including I don't have to bother much with myself.
Well, there's something I wanted to talk to you about, talking about disappearing, talking about dealing with yourself. It's almost a hip thing to be an Irish novelist these days. And it wasn't always that way. I'm thinking of the time, even as late as the 60s and the 70s when Ed O'Brien and John McGahern and Ben Kiley were being censored. But nowadays there's a sort of fashionability to it. Does this bother you?
Well, it is one of the great jokes perpetrated by mankind that Dublin has become a fashionable place to visit. And it's visited by more people than visit Venice or Rome now every year. And people adore it. Italians think it's the most marvellous place to be. And Dublin, of course, has no protection from that. In other words, a tourist can visit the National Library and watch you reading. They can get a little sticker outside. They don't have to go there to read or be anybody. You know, imagine there's no library in the world you can do that in, where you're trying to work in the National Library and a group of tourists comes to look at you.
A specimen.
And also, yes, the business of Irish narrative has, you know, that essentially, I mean, you know, that Ireland, the city of Dublin, is where Beckett and Joyce came from. But the fact that they wrote about it didn't help it much. It brought it down very much. And also their work was so individual, and so strikingly so, that therefore what you did or anyone else did didn't bother anybody much.
But there used to not, for example, be a statue of Joyce anywhere in Dublin 15 years ago. And now the place is covered with statues of Joyce, and every
Yes,
second
Dublin was, and still is to some extent, a sort of secret history of Ulysses or Dubliners. That if you know the books and know the city, you're constantly there somewhere being reminded of a moment in one or other of the books. Even of, well, especially even a Portrait of the Artist, the 3 books. I don't know Finnegan's Wake, but that you can actually experience the city all the time living there. And they've now added this gloss to it, which are a number of statues and and there are constant references and bars called Molly Bloom and bars called everything. But that is very much a gloss on the city. If you live normally in the city, you can really avoid all of this. And you can live, as we all do in cities, I think we all have our private cities. So the public fashionable Dublin and the public fashionable Irish novelist are things, are glosses, are like what you get on the top of an ice cream. You know? But the actual day-to-day business of working there, living there, isn't like that at all. It doesn't feel like that, by the way.
Right. So it says nothing about the difficulty of sitting down to get words bumping up against each
Yeah, I mean,
other.
obviously it doesn't. But I'm saying it also doesn't mean much. Just because you're an Irish writer doesn't mean you sell vast quantities in, say, Italy, Spain, or France. It really doesn't mean that. Everyone's on their own. Some people do, some people don't. So that it is something it's a journalistic invention to a large extent. It's also the invention of PR people in publishing houses. But I'm saying, of course it doesn't have any substance if you're working. But I'm saying it doesn't really even have much substance if you're just trying to sell yourself even.
And talking of coming from this tradition, everyone talks about the weight that Irish writers receive from particularly the ghosts of this century, Yeats and Beckett and of course Joyce. Do you feel any of that weight on your own shoulders?
Well, I won a essay competition when I was about 15 or 16, and I went to Dublin from rural Ireland, and I bought a whole lot of paperbacks in the main bookstore, and they were Kafka and Hemingway and Sartre, which were books that were freely available circa 1970-71, that a kid from rural Ireland could buy and bring home as very much as what you wanted. You didn't want to read Irish writing. Mm-hmm. It was dreary. And it was also on school texts. You wanted to read something that was only going to be yours. So that those French writers and American writers, and especially later on, someone like Raymond Carver had a much larger influence on Irish writing ever than James Joyce or Beckett did. Just because books were there, you didn't care where they were from. In fact, the further away from you they were, the more you wanted to read them. But there's a second thing, which is that without you knowing, the fact that Joyce and Yeats and Beckett worked in this way, in this small island, using its history and using its peculiar sort of atmosphere, gave Dublin and Ireland a significance which you wouldn't have had otherwise. In other words, someone in Montevideo or Asuncion, the capital of Paraguay, didn't feel the same growing up, who could have been a writer. That in Ireland you learned, without thinking it was anything important, that your own footsteps, your own education, your own experience was somehow very significant indeed and could be made into a book very easily indeed. Mm-hmm. And so that while you didn't think it was important, and it wasn't a heavy burden in any way, it was actually quite liberating and important.
Right. Now, you've said about contemporary Irish writing that there's no collective consciousness, no conscience of our race, no responsibilities, no nation singing in unison. Instead, diversity, the single mind, and the imagination making themselves heard. Obviously, that's cluing off the Joycean line about forging in the smithy of his soul the uncreated conscience of his race. What has changed in Ireland to allow this diversity?
Well, I think the first thing is that there's an audience, that there is a serious middle class, and that if you write novels now in Ireland, you feel that people in Ireland will be your first audience. And I think that's very important. The censorship is gone, and people are sort of super educated, and that you can come in and out of the country very easily. We have the first accounts in fiction of emigration.
Right.
You've written some of them, Joe Connor, Emma Donoghue, people like that. Whereas in the 19th century, with the mass emigration, nobody wrote the story of it because they had to go and get a job immediately. But if you have a sort of well-educated emigrants, they can actually come in and out of the country and find time to write the story as well. So we've had all that for the first time. And also, I think there isn't a huge pressure on that the writing should replace a country, which has happened in Scotland. The Scottish writing has somehow replaced public life, which there isn't any of. There's no parliament in Scotland. There's no real control of anything in Scotland. So the writers have taken the language and made that into a sort of public life. That pressure hasn't been on in Ireland. That people can really do whatever they like.
And there's a lot of movement. We're talking about emigration. I want to go into your first novel, The South. And there's a section in there where you talk about the Irish word for emigration, which is Geordie, and it comes from the word for tears, and the one to have tears is the word for emigration. And you immediately went, your first novel opens up in the streets of Barcelona in 1950, and it moves through various landscapes and returns back to Ireland. And Don DeLillo said it was a grand achievement, and it is. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. And you alternate voices in it. You go into a woman's voice, you go into third-person voice. And I thought it was a particularly daring first novel. How do you feel about that novel now?
Well, I was working as a journalist, so that in the day, I was busy with serious issues to do with public affairs. The novel then became my private life, became my way of surviving that experience, which was to write about a painter, to write about a woman trying to emigrate and find a new life in Spain, in the most exotic places in Spain. So in a way, it was my dream life during those years, the book. And it was written in a way which was as far away from journalism as I could get, which was a language which was highly charged, poetic language, using different tones and colours, So that it was, in a way, what the night was to the day, to journalism, and it was written under great pressure sometimes, where I would just have 2 days to write a scene.
Really?
And I would do everything except get anywhere close to what I was writing about during the day. You know, I would find the furthest away images from Ireland or from Irish experience in the 1980s when the book was written.
Yeah, the rhythm of the language, there's a lot of repetition, there's a lot of chanting almost to some of the passages.
Yeah.
Would you do us the big pleasure
Well, she comes back to Ireland and she starts to paint the Slaney Valley, which is near where I'm from in County Wexford. The Slaney north of Enniscorthy and south of Bunclody. This was the land the English had taken over and tilled. They had cut down the trees. They had given new names to each thing as though they were the first to live there. In the beginning, she had been trying to paint the land as though it had no history, only colours and contours. Had the light changed as the owners changed? How could it matter? At dawn and dusk, she walked along by the river. In the morning, there was a mist along the Slaney, palpable, grey, lingering. In the evening at 4, when the light faded, an intense calm descended on the river. A dark blue stillness, as though glass were moving from Wicklow to the sea. Even the sounds then were muted. A few crows in the trees, cattle in the distance, and the faint noise of water. She began to work. She started to paint as though she were trying to catch the landscape rolling backwards into history, as the horizon was a time as well as a place. Dusk on the Slaney, over and over, dusk on the Slaney, and the sense of all dusks that have come and gone in one spot, in one country, the time it was painted to stand for all time with all time's ambiguities. In the distance, the rebels lie bleeding. In the distance, no one has yet set foot. In the distance, a car is moving. In the distance, the sanatorium at Brown's Wood in Enniscorthy. In the distance, Enniscorthy Castle squats at the top of a hill. In the distance is the light and the darkness falling, the clouds moving, the Blackstairs Mountains above Bunclody, Mount Leinster, the full moon rising.
Beautiful. Your next novel is called The Heather Blazing, which comes from an old traditional tune, right?
Yeah.
And it's a portrait of a High Court judge in Ireland, and it received numerous awards. And then you did something surprising with your third novel. You jumped completely away from any other landscape that you had talked about before.
Yeah, I mean, I had lived in Spain for a good long time, altogether about 5 or 6 years, and I'd travelled in South America. And I've been in Argentina for 2 long stretches. So that whole world, especially of the aftermath of a dictatorship, you know, that what was like after the disappearances, just what it was like in Spain after Franco, and where you're haunted by what went on, you're haunted by how little people did to resist it. So the novel came to me very, very quickly in Buenos Aires when I was there for a week or so in the early 90s. The story came to me and how it would be worked out. And it was the furthest thing away. I mean, I'm from a small town in Ireland. I'm a Catholic boy. It was the furthest thing away. I mean, it's full of sex as well. It's the furthest thing away from my upbringing or what I was meant to do that there could be.
I remember meeting you in Dublin, and you turned to me at one point and said, "I'm scared." Because the book was about to come out, excuse me, the book was about to come out, and we were on the corner of Dawson Street, and you said, "I'm scared."
I was right to be scared, you know, that I was, A, very far away from my own experience, B, written in the first person, and C, it's very gay. I mean, the main character is gay, and his entire upbringing and his sexual experiences are described in great detail. And so I think that's the most crucial element in the book, you know, is a sexual element. Which is something I've been trying to write about now in contemporary Ireland.
But it strikes me as well that, I mean, the politics, the sexuality and the politics become metaphors for one another.
Well, I'm not sure metaphors, but they're meant to resound. They're meant to hit against each other all the time in the book. His inability to deal with his sexuality becomes his inability to deal with politics. And slowly his edging into the real world with his sexuality involves a sort of enlightenment, too, that's going on in the society. And they sort of do hit against each other, but it doesn't make Buenos Aires to be a great place to be gay in those years, really.
And it's tremendously
Although he does
subtle.
have a lot of fun in the book at various times. As
Oh,
well.
yeah, it's a
They go
fun
to
book as well.
Montevideo and
Yeah.
have a whale of a time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can you read us a section from that?
Yeah, well, there's just a section from the
Story of the
beginning.
Night.
It's one of the things that people in Buenos Aires are haunted by, even still now, as the stories they heard are things they knew that they never told anybody. So this is our hero, and he's gay. A few times I found pleasure in the city. It would always begin in the same way, a sharp glance at a stranger as he walked by, a turn of the head and then the watching and waiting as he stopped to look into a shop window and I moved nonchalantly towards him. I remember one such encounter, not for the sex we had, but because of a sound that came into the room as we made love, the sound of car engines revving over and over. I asked my partner what the noise was. He brought me to the window to show me the police station opposite and the cars outside, driverless but still revving, with wires going from the engines to the basement of the building. They need power, he said, but I still did not understand. They need extra power for the cattle prods, he said. I still do not know if what he said was true, if that was one of the centres in the city to which people were taken, and if we fondled each other and came to orgasm within moments of each other, to the sound of the revving of cars, which gave power to the instruments of torture. It made no difference then, because I did not pay much attention to what he said, and I remember the pleasure of standing at the window with him, my hands running down his back more than anything else. It is only now, years later, that it seems significant, perhaps the only sign I was ever given of what was happening all around me. I cannot remember the name of my companion that evening, the man I stood with at the window, but I've often wondered how he knew or thought he knew, or if he imagined, what the revving of the car's engines meant in our city at that time.
It's so brave, a book. I think it was one of the bravest books that had come out of Ireland in quite a few years. We're going to jump into your non-fiction. Can you tell me about your journeys through Catholic Europe?
Well, I realized when the Berlin Wall came down, because I went on a train journey from Bucharest right up to Gdansk, and so I spent a lot of time in Poland, that one of the things that made Europe one was Catholicism. That you could find Catholicism from Portugal right over into Poland and into Lithuania. And that in Poland and Lithuania, Catholicism had been a major force in the overthrow of communism. And that the battle was now almost between liberals and Catholics in both societies. And I realized that you could do a book in which you could explore this business of what had happened to Catholicism in various societies, and what Catholicism had done to various societies. And obviously the war was still raging in the former Yugoslavia, and Catholicism was the crucial issue in Croatia. So I traveled down through Croatia into Herzegovina at that time. I went to the shrine of Medjugorje there, and I learned a lot about the relationship between, say, Catholicism and authoritarianism, and Catholicism especially and Hitler, where a number of regimes, especially Croatia, but including Slovakia and Lithuania, had collaborated very easily with Hitler and had been blamed, and the legacy of what they did remained, but that it was their Catholicism made it easier for them to do that, whereas more Protestant societies, such as the Czech Republic, what became the Czech Republic, for example, simply didn't have the stomach for that in the same sort of way. And or indeed Slovenia didn't have, or indeed Serbia for various other reasons that it was Orthodox. It was in a way closer to Turkey, but that those are closer to Russia as well. So, but all those elements, like stuff people telling me, like, oh, Lithuania. The thing is that Catholicism didn't come here until the 12th century. Now that's the most important thing about here. And you realise that legacy of how Catholicism had come, who brought it, how it had been used in the place. And so, and that included, for example, the legacy of Franco in Spain, giving Spain its peculiar Catholicism. And also how close Catholicism was to everyone in Spain, even people who didn't believe a word of it, still were fundamental Catholics, as a lot of the time was I. While I wasn't, I'm not a practicer. It got to me a lot of the time, and I realized this is a really seriously powerful ritual, this.
Very quickly, in relation to Catholicism and Ireland and, quote-unquote, the Irish question. I hate to ask you this question quickly. You walked along the border. You wrote a book about the border. Do you think it is the responsibility of an contemporary Irish writer to confront the issue, quote-unquote, of Northern Ireland?
Oh, I don't think that we have any responsibilities at all. We've had enough about our responsibility. We only have rights. So I think Irish writers have rights to do that,
right,
but absolutely no responsibility to do anything at all other than watch your next sentence and make sure the semicolon is in the right place, the full stop's in the right place, and make sure that you can say it sounds okay. Your responsibilities are to your sentences, and you don't have any other responsibilities, but you have loads of rights.
I'm so glad you said that. One very last question. If you were to live the life of another writer, meaning having his or her life and his or her words or fiction, who would that person be?
Well, for the words, I definitely want Henry James, but not the life. The life was too lonely and sad and lived an isolated way. And there are very few writers who have a great time. I mean, I do love Yeats and love the way Yeats conducted himself all his life, the mixture of the public and the private, using Dublin and London, but actually being in the Mediterranean a lot. So I suppose I would like Yeats's life and Henry James's words.
Colm, thank you so much for coming along, sharing your thoughts and your wisdom. And thank you so much to everyone at home. And that's it for now from The Writing Life.
The Writing Life is a production of the Howard County Poetry and Literature Society, all rights reserved.